Before the world knew the legend, there was a 20-year-old king standing at the edge of Asia. He would charge through a river against Persian cavalry, build a road across the sea to reach an island fortress, face Darius and the largest army Persia could gather, survive mountain ambushes, steppe horse archers, desert marches, and wars among rocks and fortresses, fight elephants under Indian rain, and near the end, leap into a city almost alone where an arrow struck his chest and nearly ended everything. This is not the story of one battle. It is the story of a campaign that began with one young king invading the greatest empire on earth and ended with a world changed forever. Alexander the Great, the complete campaign.
Before Alexander faced Persia, Macedonia had to survive itself. For generations, it stood on the edge of the Greek world, threatened by neighbors, rival nobles, and stronger city-states to the south. Then, Philip II changed everything. He built Macedonia into the strongest military power in the Balkans, phalanxes with long sarissas, companion cavalry, light troops, archers, engineers, and siege machines working as one weapon. This was the army Alexander inherited. Alexander was born in 356 BCE, the son of Philip II and Olympias. He grew up in a court filled with war, trained as a soldier from childhood, and studied under Aristotle. He read Homer, and Achilles became more than a hero from an old story. He became a model of glory.
Plutarch tells how Alexander mastered Bucephalus by noticing that the horse feared its own shadow, turning it toward the sun, calming it, and mounting it. The details may have been polished later, but Bucephalus was real. Philip trusted him early. While still young, Alexander acted as regent, helped suppress revolts, and learned command before he ever became king. Then came Chaeronea in 338 BCE. Macedonia faced Athens and Thebes in a battle for control of Greece. Philip commanded the army. Alexander, still a teenager, led part of the Macedonian forces and was linked with the decisive attack against the Theban sacred band. Greek resistance was broken. Macedonia became the dominant power in Greece. Philip formed the League of Corinth and prepared a united campaign against Persia. Then, in 336 BCE, everything nearly collapsed. Philip was murdered at Aigai during public celebrations. Alexander became king at about 20. Enemies tested him immediately. Northern tribes stirred. Greek cities questioned Macedonian power. Many believed the young king could not hold together what Philip had built. They were wrong. Alexander secured the throne, struck north, and proved that youth did not mean weakness. While he campaigned beyond Greece, rumors spread that he had died. Thebes rebelled. Alexander returned with terrifying speed. The city was captured and destroyed. Its fate became a warning to every Greek polis. Now his rear was secure enough for the campaign Philip had planned. The invasion of Persia could begin. Officially, it was revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece and a war to liberate Greek cities in Asia Minor. But Alexander's ambition was larger. Persia was the greatest empire of its age, vast and far stronger than Macedonia on paper. To attack it was a gamble. To conquer it seemed impossible.
In 334 BCE, the Macedonian army marched to the Hellespont. Europe ended behind them. Asia waited ahead. Alexander crossed into Persian territory, then visited Troy, honoring the heroes of the old war and tying himself to Achilles. From there, the army moved into Asia Minor. Persian commanders were already gathering forces to stop him. They chose their ground near a river called the Granicus. As Alexander approached the western bank, no one yet knew whether this expedition would become the greatest conquest of the ancient world or die in its first real battle. 334 BCE, the Granicus River, Asia Minor.
Alexander has just stepped into the Persian Empire. Behind him lies the Hellespont. Ahead of him stands the first army sent to stop the Macedonian invasion before it can become a conquest. The battlefield seems to favor Persia. On the far bank of the Granicus, Persian cavalry holds the higher ground above the river. Behind them wait infantry and Greek mercenaries, heavy soldiers paid to defend the empire Alexander has come to break. The river is more than water. It is a barrier. The current disrupts horses. The muddy banks destroy formation. Any army crossing must climb out under attack while enemies strike from above. Alexander has fewer men on the field. His campaign is young, dangerous, and almost broke. If he fails here, the invasion may end before it truly begins. His senior commander advises caution. Wait until morning. Let the men rest. Do not attack a defended river late in the day. It is the rational choice.
But Alexander sees a different danger. Waiting gives Persia time to strengthen the position, time to gather more forces, time to choose the next battlefield on their terms. So Alexander attacks immediately. Cavalry first, straight into the river. Within minutes, Macedonian horsemen are struggling in the current under Persian missiles. The first assault bends under pressure. Persian nobles descend from the bank to drive them back. And then Alexander enters the fight. Royal armor flashing, companion cavalry around him, the king himself charging into the water. One blade, one spear, one moment of bad luck, and the entire invasion dies in the river. By the end of this battle, Alexander will survive one of the closest calls of his life, break the first Persian field army in Asia Minor, and prove that this campaign is not a raid. It is the beginning of a conquest.
His finances were fragile. Ancient accounts emphasize how little money he had available at the start. His army had to win quickly, because without victory, there would be no captured cities, no tribute, no treasuries, and no campaign. The invasion needed momentum to survive. In Asia Minor, the Persian satraps gathered near Zelaya. These were regional governors responsible for stopping Alexander before he could secure the western coast. Among them was Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary general in Persian service. Memnon understood the situation better than most of them. Alexander did not need to be defeated in one glorious battle. He could be ruined by time. Memnon's advice was simple: avoid battle, burn supplies, destroy crops, retreat inland, use the Persian fleet to threaten Macedonia and Greece behind Alexander. If Persia refused to feed the invasion, Alexander's army might collapse without a major fight. It was probably the best strategy, but the satraps rejected it. They distrusted Memnon. He was Greek. They were Persian nobles defending their own lands. Burning their territory felt dishonorable and politically impossible. So instead of denying Alexander battle, they gave him exactly what he needed: a chance to win fast. The Persian army moved to the Granicus River and took position on the eastern bank. The river protected their front. The higher bank gave their cavalry an advantage. The Macedonians would have to cross under fire, lose order in the water, and fight uphill before the phalanx could form properly. Persian cavalry stood forward along the bank. Behind them were infantry and Greek mercenaries. Their plan was clear: hit the Macedonians while they were vulnerable, break the crossing before Alexander could bring his army across. Alexander arrived later in the day. Parmenion, his most experienced general, urged him to wait. The argument made sense. A dawn crossing might be cleaner, the army would be rested, the Persians might even abandon the river position during the night. But Alexander had not come to Asia to let Persian commanders control the rhythm of the war. He ordered the attack. A forward force entered the river to test and disturb the Persian line.
Ancient accounts connect this opening movement with Amyntas and Macedonian cavalry and light troops. Persian missiles came down from the bank. Horses slipped in the mud. Riders struggled to keep order while the current broke their formation. The Persians saw weakness and pushed down toward the river. That was the moment Alexander needed. The defenders had left the most secure part of their position. The fight had shifted into the riverbed. The Persian line had opened. Now Alexander struck with the companion cavalry. He angled his attack, used the Persian movement against them, and drove into the enemy left with the sharpest weapon in the Macedonian army. The companions charged in wedge formation. Long Ziston lances lowered. Horse against horse, noble against noble. The river crossing turned into a brutal mounted melee. Spears broke, swords came out. Men fought in mud and water while the Macedonian infantry forced its way forward behind them. Alexander was impossible to miss. He wanted his men to see him. But the Persians saw him too, and they came for him directly. Mithridates, connected to the Persian royal family, charged at Alexander and was killed. Rosaces struck Alexander's helmet and wounded him. Another Persian, Spithridates, was said to have raised his weapon for a fatal blow before Clitus the Black intervened and saved the king. For a few seconds, the whole campaign hung on individual combat. If Alexander died there, the army might still have fought bravely, but the invasion would have lost its center. He survived, and the battle changed. While the cavalry fought, the Macedonian phalanx pushed into the river. The Cereses gave the infantry reach even on difficult ground. The formation was compressed by the crossing, but it did not break. More Macedonians reached the eastern bank. The Persian cavalry had tried to break the crossing before the army could form. They failed. Now the pressure reversed. Alexander drove hard on one wing. The phalanx pushed through the center. Parmianus' side kept pressure elsewhere. What had begun as a dangerous river assault became a spreading Macedonian foothold. Once that foothold was secure, the Persian cavalry could no longer hold. The line gave way. Then it broke. Some Persian commanders were killed. Others escaped. The cavalry that had been placed to stop Alexander pulled away from the battlefield. The river was lost, but the battle was not over. Behind the Persian cavalry stood the Greek mercenaries. They had not been at the front of the first clash. They were still formed, disciplined, and dangerous. Professional soldiers, heavy infantry, men who understood shield line, spear wall, and close combat. Now they stood isolated. Alexander faced a choice. He could negotiate. He could let them surrender. He could pass them by. He did not. Alexander had framed his invasion as a pan-Hellenic war against Persia, revenge for past Persian invasions, and liberation for Greek cities in Asia. Greeks fighting for Persian gold threatened that entire story. To Alexander, they were not just enemies, they were traitors to the cause he claimed to lead. If they escaped, they would join the next Persian army. Alexander could not afford to leave thousands of trained Greek hoplites behind him, so he attacked. The phalanx advanced from the front. Macedonian cavalry moved around the flanks. The mercenaries fought hard, but they were alone, surrounded, and without cavalry support. This phase was bloody. The Greek line resisted fiercely. Macedonian losses may have been heavier here than during parts of the river fight itself, but isolation decided the outcome. The mercenary formation collapsed. Many were killed. Around 2,000 were captured according to ancient accounts and sent to Macedonia in chains as punishment for serving Persia against the Greek League. Alexander wanted the message to travel. Persia could hire Greeks, but Greeks who fought for Persia would pay a price. When the fighting ended, the numbers were less important than the result. Ancient casualty figures vary and often favor Alexander, Macedonian losses were presented as surprisingly low. Persian losses were heavier, especially among commanders and mercenaries. But the Persian army was not completely destroyed. Many escaped. Memnon survived. The Persian Empire was not shattered at Granicus. Not yet.
And still, something irreversible had happened. The first defensive line in Asia Minor had failed. The satrapal army had been beaten in open battle. The psychological barrier was gone. Alexander had crossed the Hellespont as a risky invader with uncertain finances. After Granicus, he was a victorious king moving through Western Asia Minor with momentum. Dascalium was abandoned. Sardis surrendered. Ephesus opened its gates. Other cities followed. The conquest now had money, supplies, and legitimacy. The first victory had paid for the next stage. That is why Granicus matters. It was not Alexander's greatest battle. It was not as dramatic as Issus. It was not as decisive as Gaugamela. It did not destroy the Persian Empire, but it made the conquest possible. Before Granicus, Alexander's invasion was a gamble. After Granicus, it became a campaign. The battle proved three things.
First, Persia could be beaten on Asian soil. The Achaemenid Empire had wealth, cavalry, satraps, and hired Greek soldiers. Alexander needed to show that the empire could bleed. At the Granicus, it did. Second, Alexander showed how he would command. He would not remain behind the line. He would fight where the battle was most dangerous and where the result could turn in seconds. That nearly killed him, but it also bound his army to him. Third, Granicus solved the immediate crisis of the campaign. Victory opened cities. Cities opened treasuries. Treasuries kept the army moving. Without that, the dream of conquering Persia might have ended as a short raid across the Hellespont. Parmenian's caution had been reasonable. The attack was dangerous. Alexander survived by a narrow margin.
But timing can matter as much as safety. Alexander understood that his army could not afford to wait for perfect conditions. He needed Persia to react to him, not the other way around. At the Granicus River, he seized that rhythm. Far to the east, Darius III now had to understand what had happened. This was not a border disturbance, not a young king seeking plunder before returning home. A Macedonian army had crossed into Asia, defeated a Persian force, punished Greek mercenaries in Persian service, and begun taking the cities of the Western Empire. The next time Alexander faced Persia, he would not be fighting only satraps on a riverbank. He would be moving toward the great king himself. And the next battlefield would not be a river crossing. It would be a narrow coastal plain where mountains and sea trapped two armies face to face. There, at Issus, Alexander would meet Darius III for the first time, and the war would become personal. 333 BCE, near Issus. Imagine a road where an army cannot truly spread out, cannot easily turn around, and cannot afford a mistake. To the east, mountains rise like a wall. To the west, the sea blocks the horizon. Between them lies a narrow strip of land where numbers can suddenly become a burden. And into this trap marches Alexander. He has around 37,000 men, exhausted from weeks of marching, far from home, deep inside enemy territory. But behind him, the Persian king has appeared. Darius III has come in person, not with a small regional force, but with a royal army gathered from across the empire, cavalry, infantry, elite guards, archers, and Greek mercenaries fighting under Persian pay. Ancient sources give huge numbers for this army. Modern historians debate them, but the main fact is clear. Darius had more men, more resources, and every reason to believe Alexander had been caught. The Macedonians were squeezed between geography and empire. No easy retreat, no open plain, no time to recover. For Darius, this looked like the moment the invasion would end.
But Issus would not obey the logic of numbers. Within a single day, the ruler of the largest empire on earth would do something almost unthinkable. He would leave the battlefield before the fighting was truly decided. Alexander would not conquer Persia at Issus, but he would damage something even more important than territory. He would break the image of the King of Kings. So how did a smaller, tired army trapped on hostile ground force the Persian king to flee from his own battlefield? To understand that, we have to go back before Issus. 1 year earlier, Alexander crossed into Asia and defeated Persian forces at the Granicus River. After that victory, many expected him to push inland toward the heart of Persian power.
Instead, he moved along the coast, city after city, port after port. This was not only about conquest, it was about stripping the Persian fleet of its bases. Persia still had naval power. Alexander did not. If the Persian navy could operate freely in the Aegean, it could threaten Greece and strike behind him while he campaigned in Asia. Alexander understood the danger. He could win battles in front of him and still lose the war behind him. After Granicus, Darius turned to one of the most capable commanders in Persian service, Memnon of Rhodes. Memnon avoided the kind of battle Alexander wanted. Instead, he used Persian naval strength to reopen the war in the Aegean. Islands changed hands. Greek cities began to waver. Rebellious sentiments started to spread behind Alexander's lines. For the first time, the invasion was genuinely at risk. Not because Alexander had been defeated in battle, but because his position depended on momentum, stability, and support back in Greece. Then the war changed unexpectedly. Memnon died. With him gone, the Persian counteroffensive lost direction. Darius decided the war could no longer be handled by others. He would come himself. A royal army was assembled from across the empire. This was not merely a military movement, it was a display of imperial authority. Darius marched west with his court, treasury, and family. The King of Kings was coming to end the invasion personally. Alexander moved through Cilicia toward Syria. He reached Issus first. The city fell, but some soldiers were too sick or wounded to continue, so Alexander left them behind and marched south. Then Darius made the move that changed everything. Instead of waiting ahead of Alexander, he marched through the mountain passes and emerged behind the Macedonian army. He seized Issus. There, he found Alexander's wounded. They were killed. When the news reached Alexander, the situation became clear. Darius was no longer ahead, he was behind him.
The road back was threatened. The wounded were dead. A confrontation was unavoidable. That night, Alexander gathered his commanders. The army would turn around. They would march through the darkness and retake the passes before dawn. The Macedonians moved quietly through the night. Torches burned low. Orders were passed in whispers. The army climbed back through terrain it had only recently crossed. By midnight, they controlled the heights. Guards were posted along the rocks. The army waited. And when morning came, the battlefield revealed itself below. A narrow coastal plain, the Panaris River crossing it, the sea on one side, the mountains on the other, and the Persian army waiting beyond. This battlefield neutralized much of Persia's numerical advantage. Cavalry had little room to maneuver, and massive formations were forced into a narrow space. Alexander immediately understood what that meant. The ground would reward discipline, timing, and control far more than sheer numbers. Darius deployed first. He placed himself at the center with his guards and Greek mercenaries near the river. Infantry filled the plain behind them, while cavalry concentrated near the coast where there was room to operate. Alexander formed his phalanx in the center. Parmenion commanded the left near the sea, while Alexander led the companion cavalry on the right. The two armies stood across the Panaris. For a moment, the field fell silent. Then, the Persian cavalry attacked.
They surged forward along the shoreline toward Parmenion's flank.
The fighting along the coast became fierce. Parmenian's wing came under heavy pressure, but managed to hold. At the same time, Alexander ordered the phalanx forward. The Macedonian infantry crossed the Pinarus under missile fire and collided with Persian infantry. The fighting became brutal. The Macedonian center began to struggle. Greek mercenaries and elite Persian troops pressed hard against the phalanx. The uneven ground and riverbank disrupted the Macedonian formation. The center held, but only with great effort. For a time, the battle hung in the balance. On the left, Parmenion was still fighting to survive. In the center, the phalanx was being pushed harder and harder. If Alexander waited too long, the battle could be lost. So he moved. On the Macedonian right, the companion cavalry surged forward. They crashed into the Persian left. The impact was immediate. The first Persian line buckled under the assault. Formations lost cohesion. Men were forced backward. Before the defenders could recover, Alexander pushed deeper into the gap. The Persian left began to unravel. This was the kind of moment that defined his style of warfare. Rather than fighting everywhere equally, he concentrated force at a single decisive point. But the battle was not yet won. The Macedonian center remained under pressure. Parmenion was still engaged near the sea. Alexander turned inward. His cavalry struck the Persian center from the flank while it remained locked in combat with the phalanx. The effect was devastating. Units compressed by the narrow terrain could not react quickly enough. The Persian center began to open. Dust rose, formations lost cohesion, men found themselves attacked from directions they had not expected. And then Alexander saw the symbol that mattered more than any unit on the battlefield: the royal chariot, Darius. Alexander gathered his remaining cavalry and drove toward the heart of the Persian line. In ancient warfare, the king was more than a commander. He was the symbol that held the entire army together. Faced with the risk of capture, Darius fled. Once the army saw the king leave the battlefield, resistance rapidly collapsed. The pressure on Parmenion weakened, the Persian center dissolved. Men who had not yet been defeated began to run. Issus ended not simply with military defeat, but with the collapse of confidence. Alexander pursued Darius for miles until darkness ended the chase. The Persian king escaped, but almost everything else remained behind. When Alexander returned to the Persian camp, he found immense wealth: gold, silver, treasures accumulated by the greatest empire of the age. There he also found members of Darius's family, his mother, wife, and daughters. Rather than treating them as spoils, Alexander treated them with respect and preserved their royal status. This was not only an act of mercy, it was a statement. Alexander was beginning to present himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a ruler capable of replacing the king he had defeated. According to later accounts, while surveying the royal camp and its riches, Alexander reportedly remarked to his companions, "This, it seems, is what it means to be a king." Issus did not end the Persian Empire. Darius still lived. Persia still possessed armies, cities, and vast resources. The war would continue. But after Issus, the psychological balance had changed. Before the battle, Alexander was the invader, operating deep inside enemy territory. After the battle, he was the man who had forced the King of Kings to flee, and every city, satrap, and noble family in the empire would have to consider what that meant. In the ancient world, power depended as much on perception as on armies. At Issus, that perception was shattered. Alexander entered the battle tired, outnumbered, and trapped between mountains and sea. He left with the Persian royal family in his hands, the royal camp captured, and the authority of Darius damaged before the eyes of the empire. But his campaign was far from over. After Issus, Alexander turned south, not toward Babylon, not yet. First, he needed complete control of the coast, and ahead of him stood Tyre.
January 33-2 BCE. Tyre, Phoenicia. Imagine standing on the shore of the eastern Mediterranean, watching the most powerful young king in the world stop in front of a city he cannot reach. Behind him is Alexander of Macedon, the man who had already crossed into Asia, beaten Persian forces at the Granicus, shattered Darius III at Issus, and forced city after city to open its gates. Ahead of him is Tyre. Not just a city, an island fortress. Its walls rise from the sea, its harbors are protected, its ships still move across the water. And between Alexander's army and the city stands something no phalanx can march through: the Mediterranean itself. Every other city along the Phoenician coast understands what is happening. The Persian Empire is losing control. Alexander is advancing south. The old balance of power is collapsing. But Tyre refuses to fall in line.
And that refusal creates one of the most astonishing sieges of the ancient world. Because Alexander does not have a normal path to victory. He cannot simply surround the walls. He cannot roll his siege towers across open ground. He cannot starve the city quickly while its harbors remain alive. And at the beginning, he does not have full command of the sea. Tyre believes the water will save it. Alexander decides to prove that even the sea can be turned into a battlefield. By the time this siege ends, the island will be connected to the mainland by force of human will. Ships will burn, siege towers will fall, divers will fight beneath the water. Walls that had defied conquerors will finally break, and the city that believed it could stand between Alexander and Egypt will discover what happened when he refused to move on. So how did Alexander take an island fortress without a bridge, without surrender, and without turning back?
But Alexander still had a problem. Persia was not only an empire of land, it was also a naval power. The Phoenician cities supplied ships and sailors to the Persian fleet. As long as those ports remained hostile, Alexander could not safely move deeper south toward Egypt, and he could not leave a powerful enemy naval base behind him. So he began taking the coast. Some cities surrendered, others accepted the new reality. But Tyre was different. Tyre was rich, proud, and ancient. Its island city stood offshore, separated from the mainland by water. It had 2 harbors and strong walls. It had survived because it was not easy to approach and even harder to storm. Alexander wanted Tyre under his control, but he also understood the value of symbolism. Inside Tyre was the temple of Melkart, a Phoenician god whom the Greeks associated with Heracles. Alexander wanted to enter the city and offer sacrifice there. To him, this was not just religion, it was authority. If Tyre allowed him inside, it was recognizing his power. The Tyrians refused. They did not openly declare loyalty to Persia in a simple way. They tried to hold a careful position. They would not let Persians enter, they would not let Macedonians enter. They suggested Alexander use the temple on the mainland instead. But Alexander did not accept being kept outside the island city. For him, neutrality in that moment was resistance. Tyre had made its choice. The siege began. At first, the problem looked almost absurd. Alexander's army stood on land. Tyre stood in the sea. So Alexander ordered the impossible: build a road through the water. His engineers began constructing a mole, a massive causeway stretching from the mainland toward the island. They used stone, timber, earth, and debris from old mainland Tyre. At first, progress came quickly. The water near the shore was shallow. Workers could throw material into the sea and raise a path. Every day, the Macedonians moved farther from the coast. Every day, the island seemed a little closer. But the closer they came to Tyre, the harder the work became. The water grew deeper. The waves grew stronger. Tyrian archers and engines on the walls fired down on the workers.
Tyrian ships harassed the construction. Men carrying stones became targets. Engineers became targets. The mole that had seemed like a miracle began to turn into a killing ground. Alexander responded with siege towers. Huge wooden structures were moved onto the mole, protected with hides and fitted with engines that could fire back at the defenders. From the top of those towers, Macedonian crews could shoot at the walls and protect the workers below. For a moment, the plan seemed to recover. Then, Tyre struck back.
The defenders prepared a fire ship. They loaded a vessel with flammable material, drove it toward the mole, and turned Alexander's towers into a target. When the ship hit, flames spread violently. The siege towers burned. The work on the mole was damaged. The Macedonians watched weeks of effort collapse in smoke, fire, and broken timber. For any ordinary commander, this might have been the moment to leave. The city was strong, the water was against him, the fleet was still dangerous. Egypt waited to the south. Darius still remained somewhere in the east. Alexander could have told himself Tyre was not worth the cost. But Alexander was not thinking only about walls. He was thinking about reputation. If he walked away, every enemy in the empire would learn one lesson: resist long enough and Alexander can be stopped. He could not allow that. So he rebuilt. This time, the mole was widened. The work became heavier, stronger, more protected. But Alexander also understood something important. Engineering alone would not be enough. To take Tyre, he needed the sea. Then the strategic situation shifted. Phoenician ships from cities already won over by Alexander joined him. Cypriot ships arrived as well. Suddenly, the balance changed. Tyre was no longer facing only an army trying to cross the water. It was facing a growing fleet. Alexander could now fight the city from multiple sides. He could blockade the harbors. He could bring siege engines by ship. He could pressure the island in a way the Tyrians had not expected. The siege became a battle of inventions. Tyrians sent divers and swimmers to damage Macedonian equipment and cut anchor cables. Alexander's men adapted by using chains and stronger protections. Tyrian ships tried sudden attacks. Alexander tightened the naval blockade. Macedonian engines battered the walls from ships and from the end of the mole. The defenders repaired damage, launched counterattacks, and kept fighting. Month after month passed. January became spring. Spring moved toward summer. The city still stood. Alexander's army grew frustrated. Tyre's defenders grew desperate, and the siege became more brutal with every failed attempt. This was no longer a quick campaign stop. It was a test of whether Alexander's will could outlast a city built to defy him. At last, Macedonian siege engines began to find weaknesses. Alexander tested different parts of the wall. Some attacks failed, some engines were damaged, but pressure kept building. The fleet closed in, the mole pushed forward. The defenders had fewer places to strike from safety. And then came the breach. On the southern side of the city, Macedonian ships with siege engines battered the wall until an opening could be attacked. Alexander prepared a coordinated assault. This was not a single charge, it was pressure from several directions at once. Some ships attacked the harbors, others kept the defenders occupied along the walls. Assault troops moved toward the breach. The goal was simple:
overwhelm the defenders before they could concentrate. The first men who tried to enter faced savage resistance. Tyre was fighting for survival. The Macedonians were fighting after 7 months of rage, exhaustion, and humiliation. Step by step, the attackers forced their way onto the wall. Alexander himself took part in the assault, according to the ancient accounts, driving his men forward as the breach widened and the defense began to crack. Once Macedonian troops entered the city, the battle changed. A fortress is strongest when the enemy is outside. Once the walls are lost, the same streets that protect a city can become traps. Fighting spread inside Tyre. The defenders were overwhelmed. The island fortress that had held Alexander for 7 months finally fell. The aftermath was terrible. Ancient sources give different figures, but they agree on the severity. Thousands of Tyrians were killed. Many more were sold into slavery. Some accounts say that thousands were crucified after the city fell, a punishment tied to the fury of the siege and the killing of Macedonians during the fighting. Alexander then entered the city and made the sacrifice he had originally demanded.
The gesture mattered. The city that had refused him entry had been broken open by force. Tyre was no longer a barrier, it was a warning. The consequences went far beyond one city. By taking Tyre, Alexander secured the Phoenician coast. He removed one of Persia's most important naval bases in the eastern Mediterranean. He cleared the road south towards Gaza and Egypt. And he proved that no fortress, not even one protected by the sea itself, could be considered safe. The siege also changed the landscape. The mole Alexander built did not disappear. Over centuries, sand and sediment gathered around it, and the old island became connected to the mainland. The road he forced into the water reshaped the coast long after the armies were gone. That is what makes Tyre so different from many of Alexander's battles. At Granicus, he won by shock. At Issus, he broke a royal army. At Gaugamela, he would destroy Persian power in the open field. But at Tyre, he won through persistence, engineering, adaptation, naval strategy,
and refusal to accept the limits of the battlefield. Tyre showed that Alexander was not only a cavalry commander charging at the decisive moment. He was also a siege commander who could change the terms of war itself. If the enemy hid behind walls, he brought engines. If the enemy hid behind water, he built land. If the enemy relied on ships, he gathered a fleet. If the first plan failed, he made the next one bigger. For the Tyrians, the sea had been their shield. For Alexander, it became a challenge. And when the siege ended, the message traveled across the empire faster than any army. Resistance was possible, but the cost could be unbearable. In 332 BCE, Tyre tried to stop Alexander at the edge of the Mediterranean. Instead, it became the city where he turned water into a road, turned a siege into a warning, and opened the path to Egypt. But Alexander's march was far from over. After Tyre came Gaza. 332 BCE. Gaza. Alexander has just done the impossible at Tyre. Now the coast behind him is almost secure. Phoenician fleets have changed sides. Persian naval power in the eastern Mediterranean has been weakened. Egypt lies ahead, rich, ancient, and strategically priceless. But one city still stands in his path: Gaza. In 332 BCE, it controls the road into Egypt, and Gaza refuses to open its gates. The city stands on high ground near the edge of the desert. Its walls rise above the plain. Its commander, Bates, has prepared for a long siege. Supplies have been gathered. Defenders are ready. Even Alexander's engineers doubt it can be taken by normal methods. Alexander cannot ignore it. If he marches into Egypt while Gaza remains hostile behind him, his supply lines are exposed. A Persian garrison would sit on the road between the Levant and Egypt, waiting for the moment to strike. So Alexander must take the city. But Gaza is not Tyre. There's no sea to cross, no island to connect to the shore. This time, the problem is height. The walls stand above him. His siege engines cannot easily reach. His army has already endured months at Tyre, and now another fortress demands blood, time, and patience. Then the first assaults fail. Alexander is wounded. The defenders hold. The siege drags on.
And suddenly, the road to Egypt depends on whether Alexander can break a city that has every reason to resist until the end. By the end of this video, you'll see how Alexander turned Gaza's height against it, why Baetis refused to surrender, how Macedonian engineering broke the fortress, and why the fall of this city opened the final road to Egypt. He needed the eastern Mediterranean coast secure before moving deeper into the empire. The Persian fleet depended on coastal bases. Egypt, still under Persian rule, lay south. If Alexander controlled the coast, he could isolate Persian naval power and move toward Egypt without leaving major threats behind him. Most cities had already chosen submission. Gaza chose resistance. The man responsible was Baetis, the Persian commander of the city. Ancient sources present him as determined and loyal. Gaza guarded the main approach into Egypt, and if it delayed Alexander long enough, it might buy time for Persian resistance elsewhere. Baetis had prepared carefully. The city was supplied for a siege. Its defenders included local troops and mercenaries, including Arab forces according to ancient tradition. The walls were strong, and the city stood high above the surrounding ground. That height was the key.
A siege engine is terrifying when it can reach the wall, but if the wall rises far above it, the machine loses power. Alexander's engineers looked at Gaza and saw a fortress that could not be easily stormed. The city was built on an elevated mound, and the ground around it gave the attackers no simple approach. Alexander's answer was direct. If the ground was too low, raise the ground. He ordered his men to build massive siege mounds. Earth, stone, timber, and rubble were hauled into place. The Macedonians began creating artificial platforms high enough to bring engines against the walls. It was hard labor under enemy fire. The defenders fired from the walls, launched sorties against the siege works, and tried to burn or damage the machines before they could be brought close enough to matter.
Every basket of earth pushed forward came at a cost. Alexander had just spent months building a road through the sea at Tyre. Now at Gaza, he was building a mountain against a city. At first, the defenders held. The Macedonians could not break through quickly. The siege works were difficult to complete. The walls were strong. The city had no intention of surrendering. During one attack, the defenders struck hard enough to put Alexander himself in danger. Ancient accounts describe him being wounded during the siege, likely by a missile while fighting near the works. It was not the first time Alexander had exposed himself in battle, and it would not be the last. But the wound mattered. Gaza was not a symbolic obstacle. It was a real fight.
Baetis and his men had forced the most successful commander in the world to bleed before their walls. For Alexander, that only made surrender less likely. He had built his authority on momentum. Granicus had opened Asia Minor. Issus had driven Darius from the field. Tyre had shown that even an island city could fall. If Gaza stopped him now, after Tyre, the entire message of inevitability would weaken. So the siege continued. More mounds rose. Engines were moved into position. Some of the equipment used at Tyre was brought south and adapted for the new battlefield. Towers, catapults, battering engines, and mining operations all became part of the pressure. The goal was exhaustion. Break the walls, stretch the defenders, force them to respond everywhere, make the fortress pay for every day it refuses to submit. The defenders answered with the same determination. They repaired damage, they fought from the walls, they counterattacked when they could. Gaza did not collapse because Alexander arrived. It resisted for weeks, and according to some accounts, for several months. The siege became a test of endurance. At Gaza, Alexander's army had to prove it could keep grinding forward when glory disappeared into labor, dust, and wounds. Finally, the pressure began to tell. The siege mounds brought Macedonian engines close enough to attack the walls effectively. Mining and repeated bombardment weakened sections of the defenses. Breaches opened. Alexander ordered assaults. The first attempts failed.
The defenders fought fiercely at the broken walls, where every opening became a narrow killing ground. A breach does not mean a city has fallen, it means the battle has moved to the most dangerous point. The attacker must climb through broken stone under missiles and blades. The defender knows exactly where he is coming. The Macedonians attacked again, still Gaza held. But Alexander did not stop. On another assault, the Macedonians forced their way in. Once enough men reached the wall and opened space for those behind them, the defense began to crack. The fighting moved inside the city.
At that point, Gaza's strength became its prison. The walls that had protected it now trapped its defenders with the enemy inside. Badis had resisted until the last practical moment, but no relief army came. No Persian field force arrived. No fleet could save the city. The fortress fell. The aftermath was brutal. Ancient sources say the male defenders were killed and many women and children were sold into slavery. The numbers vary, but the severity is not in doubt. Alexander made Gaza an example. There is also a darker story preserved by Quintus Curtius Rufus. According to that later Roman account, Badis refused to submit after the city fell and was executed in a cruel imitation of Achilles dragging Hector. Modern historians treat the details with caution because our sources differ, but the story survived because it captured how savage the end of the siege was remembered to be. Whatever the exact version, Badis did not surrender the city easily, and Alexander did not forgive the resistance. With Gaza taken, the road to Egypt was open. This was the strategic result that mattered most. Alexander could now move south without a hostile fortress sitting behind him on the coastal route. The last major Persian stronghold between the Levant and Egypt had fallen. Egypt did not resist him in the same way. When Alexander entered the country, he was received not as a destroyer of cities, but as a liberator from Persian rule. He went to Memphis, he offered sacrifices, he was recognized in Egyptian royal terms. Then he went to the coast and founded a new city, Alexandria. But none of that could happen safely while Gaza stood. That is why this siege matters. Gaza was not a battle of giant armies. It was not a dramatic cavalry charge. It was not the fall of the Persian king.
It was something colder and more practical. A fortress on the road, a commander who refused to submit, an army forced to build, dig, climb, bleed, and repeat until the walls gave way. At Tyre, Alexander had shown that he could cross the sea. At Gaza, he showed that he could raise the earth itself against a city. Both sieges proved the same thing. Alexander won because he adapted. If a city stood on an island, he built a causeway. If a city stood too high, he built mounds. If walls held, he brought engines. If engines failed, he mined. If the first assault was repelled, he tried again. The defenders of Gaza delayed him. They wounded him. They forced him into another hard siege after the exhaustion of Tyre. But they could not stop him. When Gaza fell, the southern coast was secure. Egypt lay open. In Egypt, Alexander would become a pharaoh. And then, with the coast secured behind him, he would turn back east, toward the battle that would decide the fate of the Persian Empire. Darius was still alive. Persia still had one last chance. And at Gaugamela, Alexander would face the largest army Darius could gather on a battlefield prepared for the final test. October 1, 331 BC, near Gaugamela in Mesopotamia. A flat, open plain. No forest, no mountain pass, no riverbank to protect a smaller army. Just dust, silence, and the sight of an empire stretching across the horizon. In front of Alexander stood the army of Darius III. Ancient accounts describe it as a force of overwhelming size, tens of thousands, perhaps far more, drawn from every corner of the Persian Empire. Cavalry filled both wings. Scythed chariots waited at the front. War elephants stood behind them. And at the center sat Darius himself, the King of Kings, ready to end the Macedonian invasion in one decisive day. Opposite him stood Alexander, around 47,000 men, far fewer than the Persians, far from home, standing on ground chosen by their enemy. This was exactly the battlefield Darius wanted, wide enough for cavalry to envelop, flat enough for chariots to tear through infantry, open enough for Persian numbers to finally matter.
By every rule of ancient war, Alexander should have been trapped, but by sunset, the Persian center would collapse. Darius would flee, and the empire that had ruled the Near East for 2 centuries would begin to fall into Macedonian hands. So how did Alexander survive a battlefield built to destroy him? And how did he turn a Persian trap into the place where Persia broke? To understand Gaugamela, you have to understand the way Alexander fought. He did not move like a cautious invader. He fought as if hesitation itself was defeat.
At the Granicus River, Alexander almost died proving that point. Then came Issus. This time, Darius himself came to stop him, but the battlefield was narrow, squeezed between mountains and sea, and Persian numbers could not fully unfold. Alexander looked past the mass of soldiers and saw the one target that mattered most: Darius. He struck toward the king. The Persian center shook, and Darius fled, leaving behind his camp, treasure, and even members of his family. Alexander learned something powerful there. In an empire built around royal authority, the king was not just a commander. He was the symbol holding the army together. Break that symbol in public, and the army could break with it.
But Darius was still alive. And as long as Darius remained king, the empire still had a center. This time, Darius would not repeat the mistakes of Issus. He would not fight in a narrow place. He would not let terrain erase his numbers. He chose a wide plain near Gaugamela and prepared the ground for the weapons he trusted most. This was not just a battlefield. It was a stage for Persian revenge. The night before the battle, Darius kept his army alert, fearing a Macedonian night attack. Some of Alexander's officers wanted exactly that: strike in darkness, avoid the full force of the trap, and weaken the Persians before dawn. Alexander refused. Ancient tradition says he would not steal victory like a thief. Whether the phrase is exact or not, the meaning fits him perfectly. He wanted Darius beaten in daylight, in front of his own army, on the ground he had chosen.
At dawn, the 2 armies formed. The Persian line looked enormous. On one wing stood Bactrian cavalry, fast riders from the eastern regions of the empire. On the other stood forces under Mazaeus, with cavalry and troops from Mesopotamia, Syria, and nearby lands. In front were scythed chariots, designed to rip lanes through packed infantry. Nearby were elephants from India, rare and terrifying to men and horses unused to them. In the center, surrounded by guards and nobles, was Darius. This was imperial power made visible. Different peoples, different languages, different weapons, all gathered under one throne. The Macedonian army was smaller, but far more disciplined. At its core stood the phalanx, heavy infantry armed with long sarissas, forming a dense wall of iron points. Around them moved lighter troops, archers, javelin men, peltasts, and elite infantry able to react where the heavy line could not. On the right was Alexander with the companion cavalry, his decisive strike force. On the left was Parmenion, ordered to hold against a Persian wing that could easily outflank him. That was the problem. Darius had width. Alexander had precision.
If the Macedonians stood still, they could be surrounded. If they advanced straight ahead, they would enter the prepared killing ground. So Alexander did something unexpected. He began moving his line to the right.
Slowly, diagonally, the Macedonians shifted across the plain, away from the center of the ground Darius had prepared. It looked strange, even dangerous, but it forced the Persian left to respond. Bessus, commanding that side, could not allow Alexander to slide beyond the prepared field, so Persian cavalry moved outward to match him. More riders stretched farther and farther from the center. That was the first weakness. Alexander was not escaping the trap, he was pulling it out of shape. The Persian line began to stretch. The connection between the left wing and the center became thinner. And when Bessus finally attacked, his cavalry surged forward against Alexander's right. The bait had worked.
Now Darius released the weapons meant to break the Macedonian line. The scythed chariots thundered forward. Their blades were built to terrify infantry, to make men lose formation before impact. Behind them came the pressure of the wider Persian advance. But Alexander had prepared his soldiers for this moment. The Macedonian line did not panic. Light troops targeted drivers and horses, missiles flew, and when the chariots reached the main formation, the infantry opened lanes. Instead of smashing through packed ranks, many chariots rushed into empty corridors, lost momentum, or were struck from the sides. The weapon that was supposed to tear the army apart failed to break it. The elephants did not decide the battle either. They added fear and pressure, but they did not shatter the Macedonian system before Alexander found his moment. On the opposite flank, the danger was much worse.
Mazaeus pressed hard against Parmenion. The Macedonian left was under real strain. If that side collapsed, Alexander's breakthrough would mean nothing. Parmenion did not need to win. He needed to hold long enough for Alexander to act. And then the opening appeared. As the Persian left was drawn outward and the center adjusted under pressure, a gap formed near the Persian middle. It was small, temporary, and surrounded by chaos. But Alexander had built his entire method of war around seeing moments like this. He gathered the companion cavalry into a wedge. Then he turned inward, not toward the nearest enemy, not toward the easiest victory, toward Darius. The Macedonian right struck like a spear into the Persian center. The battle, which had seemed spread across an enormous plain, suddenly narrowed into one terrifying point. Alexander was coming for the king. For Darius, this was the nightmare of Issus returning. His chariots had failed, his cavalry was engaged, his infantry was committed, and now the man he needed to contain was driving straight toward him. The guards fought to hold. The Persian center tightened, wavered, and began to shake under the pressure. Darius faced the choice that decides kings: stay and risk death or capture, flee and lose the confidence of the army. He fled, and the moment he turned away, the center of the Persian army began to lose its soul.
Orders weakened, units hesitated. Men who had been part of an imperial machine became soldiers trying to understand whether the battle was still being fought or already lost. The army had not been destroyed, but the symbol holding it together had vanished. Alexander pursued. If he could catch Darius, the war might end that day. But then a message reached him from the left. Parmenion was in danger. Mazaeus was still pressing hard, and the Macedonian flank could still collapse. Alexander had to choose: chase the king or save the army. He turned back. That decision mattered. It showed that even Alexander, hungry for decisive victory, understood that a captured king meant nothing if his own line broke behind him. He returned pressure to the threatened flank, stabilized the Macedonian position, and the Persian attack lost its final chance. The battle was over. Darius had escaped, but his empire had not.
Gaugamela was more than a battlefield victory. It was the moment Persian power lost its center of gravity. Before that day, Darius could still claim to be the legitimate ruler of a functioning empire. He still commanded satraps, armies, treasuries, and royal cities. He still represented continuity,
After Gaugamela, that image was shattered. Alexander advanced into the heart of Persian power. Babylon opened its gates. Susa followed. The wealth of the empire began passing into Macedonian hands. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian kingship, would eventually fall as well. But Darius was still alive, and that meant the war was not finished. Alexander could take cities, he could seize treasure, he could defeat armies, but as long as Darius lived, there remained a rival king whose name could gather resistance. But Persia was not finished fighting. January 330 BCE. The Zagros Mountains. 3 months earlier, Alexander had destroyed the main Persian army at Gaugamela. Darius III had fled east. Babylon had opened its gates. Susa had surrendered. The treasuries of the empire were falling into Macedonian hands. For the first time since Alexander crossed into Asia, the heart of Persia seemed exposed. No great field army stood between him and Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid kings. If Alexander reached it, the conquest would become a claim over the center of Persian power. But between Susa and Persepolis stood the Zagros Mountains, cold, narrow, dangerous, and inside one of those passes a Persian commander was waiting. His name was Ariobarzanes, satrap of Persis. He understood something Darius had failed to use at Gaugamela. Alexander was almost unbeatable on open ground, but in a mounting pass, the phalanx could not spread, the cavalry could not charge, and numbers mattered less than position. But Alexander did not stay in Susa for the winter. That would have been safe. He chose movement, because Persepolis still waited. To reach it, he divided his army. Parmenion took the baggage in slower troops along a safer road. Alexander took a faster route through the mountains with a picked column. It was a familiar pattern: speed over comfort, risk over delay. On the way, he encountered the Euxians, a mountain people who had long demanded payment from passing armies. Alexander refused, defeated them, and continued. After that, the roads seemed open. No major enemy appeared. The worst seemed to be behind them. That was the danger. Because the Persian gate did not look like a trap at first. The approach was broad enough to encourage movement. There was no giant army at the entrance, just a road, cliffs, and silence. But deeper inside, the pass narrowed. At the critical point, an army could not spread out. It could only move forward or backward. Ariobarzanes had prepared that point carefully. He placed defenders on the heights. He blocked the road ahead. He waited until enough Macedonians had entered the defile. Then he struck. The first shock was confusion. The enemy was above them. Stones rolled into packed ranks. Missiles fell at steep angles. The front was stopped by the barricade. The rear was still pushing into the pass. Every step made the crowding worse. Alexander had walked into a battle where courage could not solve the problem. His men could not form properly. His best troops were reduced to targets in a narrow road. The losses hurt. The humiliation hurt more. The Macedonians could not recover all of their dead, a deep dishonor for both Greek and Macedonian soldiers. Ariobarzanes had not destroyed Alexander, but he had done something almost no one else had achieved. He had stopped him. Time now worked against the Macedonians. Winter made the mountains harder. Supplies were stretched. Darius was still alive in the east. Every delay gave Persia hope. Ariobarzanes did not need to chase Alexander. He only had to hold the pass. Behind him lay Persepolis. Alexander could not solve this by attacking harder. A second frontal assault would mean entering the same road, under the same cliffs, against the same defenders. The phalanx could beat armies on open ground, but this was not open ground. So Alexander looked for another route. The ancient accounts differ on how he found it. What matters is that Alexander learned of a difficult path around the Persian position. It was steep, indirect, dangerous, and made worse with winter. If the Persians discovered the movement too soon, Alexander could lose his best men in the mountains. But doing nothing was worse. So he divided his force again. A detachment remained near the camp to keep Persian attention fixed on the front of the pass. Fires were kept burning to suggest the army was still there in strength. Alexander led the main striking force through the difficult mountain path, aiming to appear behind Ariobarzanes. The march was brutal. Cold air, unstable ground, steep climbs through rough country. If they were seen too early, the maneuver could fail. But the Macedonians kept moving. After difficult progress through the mountains, Alexander reached the rear of the Persian position. The trap had been reversed. At dawn, the attack began.
The troops facing the pass advanced from the front, drawing Persian attention toward the road they had already defended once. But this time, Alexander was not trying to force the same battle. He was closing around them. Pressure came from the high ground, then from behind. Persian defenders who had dominated the pass from above now found enemies descending into their rear. The same terrain that had protected them now made escape difficult. The fighting became desperate. The Persians did not collapse at the first shock. They resisted hard because they knew what the pass meant. If it fell, Persepolis was exposed. But once Alexander reached their rear, the defense could no longer hold. The Macedonians forced their way through. Ariobarzanes tried to break out. The sources disagree on his exact end. Some traditions say he died fighting. Others say he escaped briefly and was killed near Persepolis after being denied entry. But whatever the exact version, his resistance ended there. The Persian gate was open.
Alexander advanced toward Persepolis. The city had little chance to resist. Its governor, Tiridates, opened negotiations and surrendered the treasury. The wealth captured was enormous. Even if ancient figures are debated, Persepolis held one of the greatest royal treasuries in the ancient world. For Alexander, this was more than money. It was the material power of the Achaemenid kings. Now it belonged to him. But Persepolis was not treated like Babylon. Months later, the palace complex was burned. The burning of Persepolis remains one of the most debated acts of Alexander's life. Some ancient writers present it as revenge for Xerxes' burning Greek temples during the Persian Wars. Others connect it to a drunken celebration. Others see political calculation, a message that the old Achaemenid order had ended. Whatever the exact motive, the result was unmistakable. The ceremonial center of Persian kingship burned. Yet even this did not end the war. Darius fled farther east. Alexander pursued him into Media and beyond. But before Alexander could capture him, Darius was murdered by men from his own side, including Bessus, who then claimed royal authority for himself.
The war changed shape again. It became a struggle to secure the eastern satrapies, crush revolts, and prove that the empire now belonged to Alexander. That is why the Persian Gate matters. It showed the weakness hidden inside Alexander's strength. In open battle, he was almost impossible to defeat. But in mountains, against an enemy who refused to fight on his terms, even Alexander could be stopped. For a moment, Ariobarzanes achieved what Darius had failed to do. He halted the Macedonian advance and closed the road to Persepolis. But Alexander's answer revealed why his campaign kept moving. If the road was blocked, he found another road. If the heights controlled the pass, he took the heights. If the enemy used the mountains as a shield, he turned those mountains into a weapon. In January 330 BCE, the Persian Gate became the last great barrier before Persepolis. It was Persia's mountain stand, and for a brief moment, it worked. But only for a brief moment. Once Alexander broke through, the road opened, the treasury fell, the palaces burned, and the conquest moved east, beyond the old royal capitals, into a longer and harder war.
329 BCE, the Jaxartes River. Alexander has reached the northern edge of the world he is trying to rule. Behind him lie Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, and the dead empire of Darius III. The old royal capitals have fallen. On maps, the conquest looks almost complete. But in reality, the war has changed. To the south, Sogdiana is rising in revolt. To the north, beyond the Jaxartes River, mounted nomads gather on the open steppe. The Greeks called them Scythians. Others know them as Saka. They are not like the Persian armies Alexander has beaten before. They do not wait in deep infantry lines. They do not protect a king in the center. They do not stand still for the Macedonian phalanx. They ride, shoot, retreat, turn, and attack again. Horse archers. Fast, patient, almost impossible to pin down. Alexander has defeated kings. Now he faces warriors who do not need to hold ground to be dangerous. The river stands between them. If Alexander ignores the threat, Saka riders can cross later and strike his frontier while Sogdiana burns behind him. If he tries to cross carelessly, his men can be killed in the water before they form. If he chases too far into the steppe, his army can be stretched, surrounded, and worn down. This is not Gaugamela. This is not a royal army waiting to be broken. This is a different kind of war. By the end of this battle, Alexander will use artillery, boats, cavalry, infantry, archers, and a deliberate bait maneuver to force steppe horsemen into the one thing they should never allow: a controlled battle. This is the Battle of the Jaxartes. The eastern satrapies were not quiet. Local leaders resisted. Garrisons were threatened. Cities rebelled. The farther Alexander moved from the Mediterranean, the harder victory became to hold. The war was no longer a march from one great battlefield to another. Now it was mountains, rivers, raids, ambushes, revolts, and enemies who knew every path better than the Macedonians. At the Jaxartes, Alexander founded a new city, Alexandria Iskate, Alexandria the furthest. It was meant to mark the frontier, guard the river, and show that Macedonian power had reached the edge of Central Asia. But to the people of the region, this was not just a city, it was a warning. A foreign king was planting a permanent military base in their world. Almost immediately, the frontier became unstable. Settlements resisted, fighting spread. Ancient sources say Alexander was wounded during this period, a reminder that even after his greatest victories, the East could still hurt him.
Then, a more serious report arrived. Spidomenes, one of the most dangerous leaders of the Sogdian resistance, was threatening Mariconda. Alexander had a crisis behind him. But across the Jaxartes, Saka horsemen were watching from the northern bank. If he turned south without dealing with them, they could cross the river, raid his new city, and join the chaos. So Alexander made his decision. Before he could return to Sogdiana, he had to strike north. The Saka believed they held the advantage. The Jaxartes protected them. Their horses gave them speed. Their bows let them attack from distance. And if the Macedonians crossed in small groups, the nomads could ride in, shoot them down, and disappear before the main army landed.
The most dangerous moment would be the crossing itself. Men in boats cannot fight properly. Cavalry cannot charge from rafts. The phalanx cannot form in the river. The Saka expected to turn the water into a trap. Alexander prepared something different. He did not begin with the crossing. He began with machines. Macedonian artillery was brought to the riverbank. Catapults and engines could shoot farther than ordinary bows. That mattered because the Saka were used to controlling distance. They expected to stay just beyond danger. Instead, missiles began striking the far bank before the Macedonians even entered the water. The nomads were forced back. Ancient tradition says one of their leaders was killed early by this long-range fire.
Whether every detail is exact or not, the effect was clear. Alexander had opened space for a landing. Then came the crossing.
Boats and rafts moved together, not in weak, scattered groups. The goal was mass. A small force could be destroyed piece by piece. A large crossing could build a bridgehead before the enemy reacted. The first troops to land were missile troops and light infantry. They moved forward to protect the bank. Then cavalry followed. Then heavier troops came across. Step by step, Alexander built an army on the northern side of the river. At this point, the Saka still had the smartest option: withdraw. If they rode away into the steppe, Alexander could not force a decisive battle. His infantry could not catch them. His cavalry could not safely chase forever. The nomads could refuse the fight and return later. But Alexander needed them to commit. So he gave them a target. A small mounted detachment moved ahead of the main force. It looked exposed, too far forward, easy to surround. The Saka took the bait.
Their horse archers closed around the Macedonian riders and began attacking from all sides. To them, this looked like the kind of fight they understood. Isolate a smaller group, shoot it down, escape before help arrives. But the exposed detachment had done its job. It fixed the Saka in place. Now Alexander could move. Light infantry and archers advanced. Cavalry pressed forward. The phalanx and heavier troops supported the movement from behind. The nomads tried to keep space, but the space was shrinking. This was the key to the battle. Alexander was not trying to chase horse archers across the endless steppe. He was creating a temporary battlefield around them. If they moved one way, cavalry pressed them. If they slowed, missile troops hit them. If they tried to break away, Macedonian units narrowed the gaps. For the first time, the Saka were being forced to fight inside a pattern Alexander controlled. Their greatest strength was movement. Alexander's entire plan was to steal that movement from them. The fighting became deadly. The Saka commander, named in some accounts as Satrices, was killed. Many riders fell. Others were captured. The rest began to break away toward the open steppe. Alexander pursued, but not endlessly. He understood the danger. A victory at the river could become a disaster if his army scattered too far into nomad country. He was also dealing with wounds, illness, and rebellion behind him. So the pursuit stopped. The surviving Saka escaped beyond reach, but the result was already decided. The northern bank had been cleared. The frontier was secure for the moment. Then came Alexander's most important political move. He released captured prisoners without ransom. This was not simple mercy. It was strategy. Alexander did not want a permanent war north of the Jaxartes. His real danger was Sogdiana. He needed the Saka to accept the river frontier, not turn every tribe beyond it into a new enemy. The message was clear. Cross the river and you can be beaten. Stay beyond it and peace is possible. That balance mattered because Alexander had no time to be dragged deeper into the steppe. Spidomenes was still active. Metaconda was threatened. The revolt in Sogdiana demanded attention. The Battle of the Jaxartes is often overlooked because it is not one of Alexander's famous great battles. There was no Persian king on the field, no giant imperial army, no final collapse of an empire in one afternoon. But tactically, it may be one of his most impressive victories because the enemy was almost impossible to force into battle. At Gaugamela, Alexander had to break a massive army. At Tyre, he had to attack a city protected by the sea. At the Persian Gate, he had to reverse a mountain ambush. At the Jaxartes, he had to defeat an enemy whose best tactic was refusal. Refusal to stand. Refusal to be caught. Refusal to fight the battle Macedon wanted. And yet, he forced the fight anyway. He used artillery before the crossing. He crossed in mass. He protected the landing. He offered bait. He fixed the enemy. Then he closed with several arms working together. This was not just bravery, it was coordination. The farther Alexander marched, the more his enemies changed.
Persian cavalry, Greek mercenaries, island cities, mountain defenders, steppe horse archers, Indian elephants. Every problem demanded a different answer. At the Jaxartes, Alexander proved that his army was not only a weapon for set-piece battles, it could adapt at the edge of the known world. But victory on the river did not end the war. It only freed Alexander to face the harder fight behind him. Sogdiana was still burning. Spitamenes was not defeated. The resistance would pull Alexander into some of the most exhausting campaigns of his life. There would be no single glorious battle to finish it. Only raids, betrayals, mountain strongholds, forced marches, and years of blood. Alexander had secured the northern frontier. Now he had to conquer the land behind it. And in Sogdiana, he would learn that winning an empire was easier than holding one. 329 BCE, Sogdiana. Alexander has already won the war that should have made him unstoppable. But then Alexander reaches the Far East, and the empire he thought he had taken begins to fight back, not in one great battle, not with a king standing in the center of a vast army, not on a plain where the companion cavalry can decide history in an afternoon. This war is different. It is fought in mountains, deserts, river valleys, and fortified rocks. It is fought by horsemen who vanish before they can be pinned down, by local leaders who strike garrisons, disappear into the countryside, and return when the Macedonians march away. This is Sogdiana. And here, from 329 to 327 BCE, Alexander faces one of the hardest campaigns of his life. Because conquering Persia was not the same as ruling it. At Gaugamela, Alexander broke Darius. At Persepolis, he took the heart of the empire. But in Sogdiana, he discovered something more dangerous than a royal army, a land that refused to stay conquered. By the end of this campaign, Alexander will fight rebels, horse archers, mountain strongholds, betrayal, exhaustion, and one commander who nearly turns the East into a permanent war. His name is Spitamenes, and for a time, he becomes the enemy Alexander cannot crush in one battle. To understand the Sogdian campaign, we need to begin with the death of Darius III. After Darius fled east, he was seized by men from his own side. One of them was Bessus, satrap of Bactria, who tried to claim the Persian throne for himself. Alexander could not allow that.
If Bessus survived as a rival king, the war was not truly over. Resistance would still have a royal name to gather around. So Alexander crossed into Bactria and Sogdiana, pursuing the last political remains of a Achaemenid power. Bessus did not last. He was betrayed, captured, and handed over to Alexander. But the removal of Bessus did not bring peace. It created a new problem. The people of the region had not accepted Macedonian rule simply because Darius was dead. When Alexander began planting garrisons, founding cities, and demanding obedience, resistance spread. The land itself made that resistance powerful. Sogdiana lay between rivers, deserts, mountains, and steppe. Nobles could move from fortress to fortress. Horsemen could attack quickly and escape before heavy troops arrived. Alexander had stormed cities before. He had broken armies, but this was not Tyre. This was not Gaugamela.
There was no single target that would make the whole region surrender. Spitamenes emerged as one of the leading figures of resistance. Ancient accounts connect him with the revolt in Sogdiana and the attack on Mariconda, the regional capital. When Alexander heard that Mariconda was threatened, he could not ignore it. A garrison under attack in a newly conquered region meant Macedonian power was not yet real. So Alexander sent a force to relieve the city. That decision led to disaster. The Macedonian detachment moved against Spitamenes, but he refused to fight the battle Macedon wanted. He drew them away, used speed,
local allies, and mobile horsemen then struck when they were vulnerable. The Macedonian force was destroyed. For Alexander, this was more than a loss. It was a warning.
He had defeated kings, but Spidomenes was not trying to be another Darius. He was creating a war of movement, raids, traps, and exhaustion. Alexander rushed toward Maricanda, but Spidomenes withdrew before he could be trapped. That became the pattern. Alexander arrived. The enemy vanished. Alexander moved elsewhere. The rebellion returned. Every victory seemed temporary. Every garrison needed protection. Every road could become dangerous. For an army built around decisive battle, this was maddening. Alexander could not solve Sogdiana with one cavalry charge. He had to divide forces, build strongholds, punish rebels, secure routes, and keep moving through hostile country. And the campaign became increasingly brutal. Fortified settlements were stormed. Villages were punished or relocated. New cities were founded to hold the land with Macedonian and Greek settlers.
Alexander was no longer only the brilliant young commander of Granicus and Issus. In Sogdiana, he became an occupier fighting an insurgency. Spidomenes understood the cost of that war. He did not need to defeat Alexander in a single battle. He needed to make the region impossible to govern. He needed to keep pressure on garrisons, inspire revolt, and force Alexander to spend months chasing shadows. But Spidomenes also depended on allies. Nomads, local nobles, and regional fighters could support him while he seemed dangerous. But if Alexander made resistance too costly, those alliances could break. That is what began to happen. Alexander adapted. He stopped thinking only in terms of major battles. He used mobile detachments. He fortified positions. He struck communities that supported the uprising. The war became a contest of endurance. Could Spidomenes keep the revolt alive longer than Alexander could keep his army moving? In 328 BCE, the struggle began to turn.
Spidomenes attacked again, but Macedonian forces and local allies increasingly limited his room to move. Those who had followed him now faced a choice: continue a war against a king who never stopped, or cut themselves free from a losing cause. According to ancient tradition, Spidomenes was eventually betrayed and killed by his own side. His head was sent to Alexander. The most dangerous rebel leader in Sogdiana was gone. But the campaign was not finished, because resistance did not depend on one man alone. There were still fortresses, still mountain strongholds, still nobles who had not submitted. And one of the most famous was the Sogdian Rock, a fortress believed to be almost impossible to take. Its defenders felt safe because the rock rose steeply above the surrounding land. No siege ramp could easily reach it. No phalanx could climb a cliff in formation. When Alexander demanded surrender, the defenders mocked him. According to the ancient story, they asked whether he had soldiers with wings. It was the wrong question to ask Alexander. He called for volunteers, men skilled at climbing from mountain regions of his army. They were promised rewards if they reached the top. The climb took place at night. The soldiers used ropes, iron pegs, and whatever holds the rock allowed. Some fell and died in the darkness. Others kept climbing. At dawn, the defenders looked up and saw Macedonians standing above them. The impossible position had been reached. Alexander sent the answer back. He had found his winged men. The psychological effect was decisive. The fortress surrendered. Among those captured was Roxana, daughter of a local noble, Oxyartes. Alexander later married her. That marriage mattered. It was not only romance, even if ancient writers describe Alexander as being struck by her beauty. It was also politics. By marrying into the local aristocracy, Alexander signaled that he was not merely destroying the East, he was trying to bind it to his new empire. Sogdiana forced him to become more than a battlefield commander. He had to balance terror with negotiation, punishment with alliances, garrisons with diplomacy.
By 327 BCE, the worst of the resistance had been crushed. The rebel leader was dead. The mountain strongholds had fallen. Local nobles had been brought into Alexander's system. The eastern frontier was not truly peaceful, but it was controlled enough for Alexander to move on. That alone shows why this campaign matters. Sogdiana did not give Alexander one clean victory to celebrate. It gave him something harder, a lesson.
An empire cannot be held by winning one battle. It has to be secured road by road, fortress by fortress, alliance by alliance. At Granicus, Issus, Tyre, and Gaugamela, Alexander proved he could beat armies, kings, walls, and empires. But in Sogdiana, he learned what happened after victory. The enemy did not always stand in front of you. Sometimes the enemy was distance, terrain, local resistance, winter, supply, and the refusal of people to accept a new master. This campaign nearly disappears beside the famous battles, but it may reveal more about Alexander than any of them.
It shows his endurance, adaptability, ruthlessness, and political instinct. By the time Alexander left Sogdiana, he was no longer simply chasing the ghost of Persia. He was building something new, unstable, and enormous. A Macedonian king ruling Persian lands through local nobles, Greek cities, military colonies, garrisons, and fear. The campaign had drained men and patience, but it opened the road to the next frontier, India.
327 BCE, Aornos. Alexander has reached the mountains before India. Behind him lie the ruins of the Persian Empire, the long war in Sogdiana, the death of Darius, and years of marching farther east than any Macedonian army had ever imagined. But before he can reach the great rivers of India, before he can face King Porus and the war elephants at the Hydaspes, one fortress blocks the road. Aornos, a massive mountain stronghold rising above the lands near the Indus. To the people of the region, it is more than a defensive position. It is a refuge where soldiers, civilians, and local fighters can gather when everything below has fallen. To Alexander, it is a problem he cannot leave behind. The rock is high, the slopes are steep, the approaches are difficult, and normal assault looks almost impossible.
Ancient writers later connected the place with legend, claiming even Heracles had failed to take it. Whether that story was history, myth, or propaganda, Alexander understood its power. If he captured Aornos, he would not only clear the road, he would defeat a symbol. If he ignored it, enemies could sit behind him in the mountains while he marched toward the Indus. If he attacked and failed, every tribe and hill fortress ahead would learn that Alexander could still be stopped. So he chose the only answer that matched his reputation. He would take the rock. By the end of this siege, Alexander will climb where armies were not supposed to climb, use engineers where brute force is useless, seize the surrounding heights, and turn a fortress of legend into another warning on the road to India. This is the siege of Aornos. Resistance in the region was fierce. Fortresses such as Massaga had already shown that local defenders could fight brutally and delay the advance. Alexander could not afford to leave strongholds untouched behind him. Every fortress left unconquered was a threat to supply lines, communications, and morale. Aornos was different because of its position and reputation. It dominated the surrounding country. It offered safety to those fleeing Macedonian advance, and it stood like a final challenge before Alexander moved toward the Indus. His men had already seen him do the impossible. At Tyre, he built a road through the sea. At the Persian Gate, he reversed a mountain ambush. At the Jaxartes, he forced nomad horse archers into battle. Now the question was different. How do you take a fortress when the fortress is the mountain itself?
Alexander first needed information. The site could not be rushed blindly. Its cliffs, paths, nearby hills, and defensive positions had to be understood. Ancient accounts mention local guides helping the Macedonians identify approaches around the rock. Whether they came willingly or under pressure, their knowledge mattered.
This was not a battlefield where cavalry could decide the outcome in one charge. This was a siege of terrain. Alexander had to isolate the fortress, control the nearby heights, and create a way to bring pressure against a position nature had already fortified. The first key was a neighboring height. A direct attack against the main rock would be extremely costly, but if Macedonian troops could seize a position near it, they could threaten the defenders from above and from the side. Alexander sent a detachment to occupy a nearby spur. Ancient tradition connects this operation with Ptolemy, one of his trusted commanders. The move was dangerous. A force on the heights could be cut off before the main army arrived. The defenders understood the danger and attacked.
If they drove the Macedonians off that position, Alexander's siege would stall before it truly began. Fighting broke out on the rough ground. The Macedonian detachment held long enough for Alexander to bring support. Once the nearby height was secured, the siege changed shape. Aornos was no longer an unreachable rock staring down at an army below. Now Alexander had a foothold. But a foothold was not enough. Between the Macedonian position and the fortress lay difficult ground, including a ravine or gap that made a direct approach almost impossible. So Alexander turned again to engineering. His men began building. Timber, stone, earth, and brush were dragged into place to create an approach across the broken ground. It was brutal labor under danger from above. The defenders could see what was happening. Every meter of progress made the fortress less secure. This was the same logic Alexander had used before. If the sea blocked him at Tyre, he built into the sea. If Gaza stood too high, he raised the ground. If Aornos stood beyond a ravine, he would fill the gap. The defenders resisted. They launched attacks and tried to disrupt the work. They knew that once Alexander's approach reached a certain point, the rock would no longer feel invincible. The struggle became a race. Could the defenders break the Macedonian foothold before the engineers brought the assault close enough? Or would Alexander slowly turn impossible terrain into a road? Day by day, the Macedonians advanced their works. The men were exhausted, but every soldier understood the story. This was the rock even heroes were said to have failed against. If they took it, they would prove that nothing on the road ahead was beyond them. Alexander understood the psychological battlefield as well as the physical one. Aornos was not only about a fortress, it was about reputation before the Indian campaign. If local rulers heard that the rock had fallen, many would think twice before trusting walls, cliffs, or legends. The defenders also understood the meaning of the siege. They could see the Macedonians getting closer. They could see the surrounding positions falling under Alexander's control. At some point, the fortress that had seemed like shelter began to feel like a trap. Ancient accounts say the defenders eventually tried to negotiate or appeared ready to surrender, but also attempted to abandon the position during the night. Alexander did not allow them to escape cleanly. When the defenders began withdrawing, Macedonian forces struck. The retreat became chaos. Some defenders were killed in the escape. Others fled into the difficult terrain. The position they had trusted was lost. Then Alexander occupied the rock. Aornos had fallen. The fortress that had seemed unreachable was now in Macedonian hands. For Alexander, the victory was exactly what he needed. It cleared a dangerous stronghold from his rear. It secured the route toward the Indus. It gave the army another story of impossible success. And it sent a message through the region. Mountains could fall. Rocks could fall. Places protected by legend could fall. This was not the largest siege of Alexander's career. It was not as famous as Tyre. It was not as politically symbolic as Persepolis. It was not as tactically dramatic as Gaugamela. But Aornos shows something crucial about the later Alexander. By 327 BCE, he was no longer only the young king who won battles by charging at the decisive point. He had become a commander who solved every kind of problem. Cities, rivers, mountains, nomads, fortresses. Every enemy tried to change the battlefield against him. Alexander answered by changing it again. At Aornos, he did not win because the rock was easy.
He won because he refused to accept what the terrain seemed to say. The mountains said no army could approach. He seized the nearby heights. The ravines said no road existed. He built one. The defenders trusted distance, cliffs, and reputation. Alexander turned all three against them. And when the siege ended, the road east opened wider. The army was now moving toward the Indus and beyond it, toward the greatest unknown of the campaign. India was not Persia. Its kings commanded armies Alexander had not yet faced. Its rivers were wide and dangerous.
Its elephants could terrify horses and break formations. Aornos was the last great mountain challenge before the river war ahead. After taking the rock, Alexander crossed deeper into the lands beyond the old Persian frontier. Alliances were made, cities submitted, others resisted. The campaign moved toward the Hydaspes.
May 326 BCE, northern India, the Hydaspes River. Alexander the Great had reached a place where victory could no longer be taken by speed alone. Across the river stood King Porus, ruler of the Parava kingdom. Behind him waited his army, infantry, cavalry, chariots, and the weapon that made this battlefield unlike anything Alexander's men had faced before: war elephants. Not one or two, more than 100 of them, spread across the line like moving towers. Porus had chosen his position carefully. The Hydaspes was swollen and violent. A direct crossing would force the Macedonians into the water under enemy watch. Horses could panic near elephants. Infantry would arrive scattered and vulnerable. If Porus struck while Alexander's men were still climbing out of the river, the battle could be over before it truly began. Alexander had conquered from Greece to the edge of India. He had broken Persia, crossed mountains, and defeated every army sent against him. But this river stopped him. So he did something more dangerous than attack. He waited. For days, then weeks, the Macedonian camp became a performance. Soldiers moved up and down the western bank. Cavalry rode toward possible crossing points. Fires appeared at night. Units shifted openly as if an assault might begin at any moment. Every time, Porus reacted. His scouts watched, his troops prepared, his elephants stayed ready. If Alexander crossed, Porus intended to meet him at the water and crush him there. But Alexander was not trying to cross in front of him. He was teaching Porus to stop believing what he saw. Night after night, Macedonian horsemen approached the river with noise and movement. Each time it looked like the beginning of an attack. Each time, nothing followed. No boats, no charge, no battle. Slowly, the pattern worked. Macedonian movement became routine. False alarms became expected. Porus's reactions began to weaken. And far upstream, the real plan was taking shape. About 17 miles from the main camp, Alexander had found a better crossing. The river split around covered ground and islands, hiding movement from the main Indian position. Boats and rafts were prepared quietly. The army made ready in secret. To keep the deception alive, a senior officer stayed visible in Alexander's royal armor back in camp. From across the river, it still looked as if the king had not moved. Then the storm came. Under rain and thunder, Alexander slipped away with a chosen force, roughly 6,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Not the whole army, just enough to cross first, hold the far bank, and open the battle before Porus understood what had happened. In the darkness, the Macedonians entered the river, and almost immediately the plan went wrong. After crossing the first channel, they thought they had reached the opposite bank. Instead, they had landed on an island. Another channel still lay ahead. Now dawn was coming. The men had to drag boats and rafts across wet ground, push them into the second stream, and cross again before Porus could react. They made it, but not unseen. By the time Alexander's force assembled on the eastern bank, Porus's scouts had spotted the crossing. The surprise was damaged. Alexander was across the Hydaspes with only a fraction of his army, his infantry still forming, his cavalry still gathering, and the main force still on the other side. Porus moved fast. He sent his son forward with cavalry and chariots to strike Alexander before the Macedonians could organize. It was the right idea. If this first attack pinned Alexander near the river, the main army could arrive and finish him. But the ground near the bank had turned against the Indians. Days of rain had made the soil soft and heavy. Chariots needed open, firm terrain. Here their wheels sank. Horses struggled. Formations lost order before they could build speed. Alexander saw the weakness at once. His mounted archers attacked first, sending arrows into the stalled chariots and cavalry. Porus's son pushed forward to support the attack, but now his force was fighting in mud and confusion. Then the companion cavalry hit. The fight was fierce, but the Macedonians had the advantage. The chariots never became the weapon they were meant to be. In the soaked ground, they turned into obstacles. The Indian cavalry began to give way. Porus's son tried to rally his men. He was killed in the fighting. The first Indian detachment collapsed, and the survivors rode back toward the main army. Now King Porus knew two things. Alexander had crossed, and his own son was dead. He marched out himself. The battle that followed was not between two fully deployed armies. That is what makes Hydaspes so dangerous. Alexander had more troops in the campaign, but only his crossing force stood on Porus's side of the river. Much of the Macedonian army remained behind the water. Porus formed his line to destroy that force. His cavalry stood on both wings. His infantry held the center. In front of them, he placed the elephants, spaced across the field to block and break the Macedonian phalanx. This was the heart of the problem. The phalanx was terrifying against men. Its long spears created a wall that cavalry and infantry struggled to penetrate. But elephants were different. If they crashed into the line, they could rip gaps through the formation, crush soldiers underfoot, and turn discipline into panic. Alexander could not simply drive straight into them. So he began with the cavalry. His horse archers moved against Porus's left flank, not to destroy it immediately, but to force a reaction. Porus shifted strength toward the threatened side, trying to protect the wing. That movement created the opening Alexander needed. Conus, commanding another Macedonian cavalry group, swung wide across the field. When Porus weakened his other flank, Conus struck from behind. The Indian cavalry suddenly found itself attacked from two directions. The pressure broke it. Riders fled back toward the center, toward the only protection left, the elephant line. Then the elephants advanced. For the Macedonians, this was a nightmare made real. Huge animals came forward with crews on their backs, archers firing from above, drivers pushing them into the enemy. Men were thrown, crushed, impaled, and scattered. The phalanx, so often unstoppable, suffered terribly. But Alexander had prepared for the one weak point every elephant had: control. Light infantry moved among the formations with a brutal purpose: target the drivers and crews. A controlled elephant was a weapon. A wounded elephant without command was chaos. As mahouts fell, the animals began to lose direction. Some turned away, others panicked, some crashed back into Porus's own infantry.
The weapon meant to shatter the Macedonian center now tore holes through the Indian line behind it. Men trapped near the elephants had nowhere to go. The center became crowded, confused, and bloody. Only then did Alexander's larger plan close. Craterus, left earlier across the river with the remaining troops, crossed once Porus was fully committed. Alexander pressed from the front and sides. Craterus arrived from behind. Cavalry tightened around the field. The phalanx pushed forward. Porus's army was trapped. The collapse did not come cleanly. Elephants still raged, infantry still fought, men died in brutal close combat. But the structure of the Indian army was broken. The cavalry had been driven back, the center had lost order, the elephants were no longer a wall, they were chaos. Yet Porus did not flee. Even wounded, he remained on his elephant as the battle fell apart around him. Ancient accounts present him as a ruler who kept fighting long after the outcome had turned against him. Alexander had seen kings abandon battlefields before. Porus was not one of them. At last, Alexander sent a man Porus knew to persuade him to stop resisting. When Porus was brought before Alexander, the Macedonian king asked how he wished to be treated. Porus gave the answer that made the story famous, as one king should treat another. Alexander respected him. Instead of removing Porus, he restored him to power and expanded his territory. It was smart politics, but also recognition. Alexander had defeated a strong enemy, and he chose to keep him as a ruler rather than erase him. The Battle of the Hydaspes was over, but it had cost more than a normal victory. This was one of the hardest battles of Alexander's campaign. His army had survived the river, the mud, the chariots, the cavalry, and the elephants, but the fighting had been vicious. The Macedonians won, yet the battle showed them what awaited deeper in India. And then came a loss Alexander felt personally. Bucephalus, the horse he had ridden since youth, died after the battle. He had carried Alexander from Macedon through Persia and into India. Alexander founded a city near the battlefield and named it Bucephala.
326 BCE, the Indus Valley. Alexander has reached the limit. For almost 10 years, his army has followed him from Macedon to India. They have crossed the Hellespont, broken Persian armies, burned through mountains and deserts, and marched farther than any of them once believed possible. But after the Hydaspes, the army stops. Beyond the Hyphasis River lie new kingdoms, unknown armies, and stories of more war elephants waiting in the east. Alexander wants to continue. His men do not. For the first time, the king who forced rivers, cities, and empires to bend cannot force his own soldiers to take one more road. So he turns south. Not home, not yet.
He will march down the rivers towards the Indian Ocean, secure the lands behind him, and prove that this is not a retreat. But the road south is dangerous. The Malians and Oxydraci are preparing resistance. If they unite, Alexander may face a fresh enemy while his army is exhausted, wounded, and far from every familiar supply line. So Alexander moves as he always has, faster than his enemies believe possible. He divides his forces. He strikes before they can gather. And in one fortified city, during one desperate assault, the king who has survived Granicus, Issus, Tyre, Gaugamela, the Persian date, Sogdiana, Aornos, and the Hydaspes will make the most reckless decision of his life. He will climb the wall first.
He will jump inside almost alone, and an arrow will drive into his chest. For a moment, the conqueror of Persia lies dying behind enemy walls. If Alexander dies there, the army may never reach Babylon again. This is the final chapter of Alexander's campaign, the Malian assault, the descent to the ocean, the disaster of Gedrosia, the attempt to merge Macedonians and Persians, the death of Hephaestion, the fever in Babylon, and the question no one could answer after he was gone: who could inherit a world conquered by one man? To understand the end, we begin at the Hyphasis. After defeating Porus at the Hydaspes in 326 BCE, Alexander still wanted to go east. He believed another victory was possible. His soldiers believed the campaign had already gone too far.
They had been away for years. Many had left Macedon as young men and were now veterans, scarred by sieges, marches, wounds, and monsoon rains. They had fought Persians, Sogdians, Scythians, Indians, and elephants. Now they wanted to see home again before the world swallowed them completely. Alexander withdrew into his tent and waited, hoping silence would shame them into obedience. It did not. At last, he accepted what no Persian king had forced him to accept: a limit. He ordered altars built to mark the eastern edge of the expedition, then turned toward the Indus. But turning back did not mean peace. The Indus Valley had to be secured, cities had to submit, local peoples had to understand that the Macedonians were not fleeing India, but moving through it as conquerors.
The Malians and Oxydraci were among the most serious threats. Ancient sources present them as powerful peoples who considered joining against him. If they united, they could strike a tired army during the river campaign. Alexander's answer was speed. He split his army into columns, sending commanders along different routes while the fleet moved on the rivers. The goal was simple: prevent the enemy from concentrating. This was no longer the clean drama of Gaugamela. It was pressure, forced marches, sudden attacks, river movement, and fortified towns. Alexander hit Malian settlements before resistance could fully unite. Towns were stormed, defenders were overwhelmed. Those who tried to escape found other Macedonian detachments waiting. Then came the city remembered for the wound. The defenders withdrew into a fortified position. The Macedonians brought ladders, but the assault slowed under fire. Alexander saw hesitation where he wanted momentum, so he took a ladder himself. He climbed before the army could follow. For years, that kind of courage had made his soldiers worship him. At Granicus, it nearly killed him. At Tyre and Gaza, it had carried him through walls and wounds. Here, it went too far. Too few men reached the wall behind him. The ladder broke or became useless under the crush. Alexander stood exposed about the defenders. Instead of retreating, he jumped inside. Only a handful of companions reached him.
Peucestus carried the sacred shield from Troy. Leonidas fought beside him. Abritas, another defender of the king, was killed. Inside the city, Alexander was almost alone. The defenders surrounded him. Then an arrow struck. It pierced his armor and drove into his chest, near the lung. Alexander fell. Blood poured from the wound. His breathing failed. The man who had crossed Asia collapsed in a hostile city where most of his army could not reach him. Outside the wall, panic became rage. Macedonians clawed upward. Some climbed without proper ladders. Others forced gates and breaches. The battle was no longer about taking the city.
It was about reaching the king. When they broke through, Alexander was still alive, but barely. The arrow had to be removed. Ancient accounts differ on the exact details, but they agree on the danger. He lost so much blood that many believed he was dying. Then the rumor spread. Alexander was dead. No rumor could be more dangerous. When Alexander was strong enough, he appeared before the army. He could barely move, but he showed himself alive. The king had not died. The campaign could continue. After the Malian resistance was broken, the remaining opponents submitted. Alexander moved down the rivers toward the mouth of the Indus.
At Patala, near the delta, he reached the edge of the ocean. He ordered Nearchus to lead the fleet from the Indus along the coast toward the Persian Gulf. Then Alexander divided the land forces. Some went by safer routes. Alexander himself led a large part of the army through Gedrosia.
It became one of the worst disasters of the entire expedition. The Gedrosian desert was not a battlefield, but it killed like one. Heat, thirst, sand, poor supplies, and broken logistics destroyed men, animals, and baggage. The army that had survived Persian cavalry, siege towers, Scythian horse archers, mountain passes, and Indian elephants now suffered against emptiness. Gedrosia was a catastrophe.
Men died of thirst. Animals collapsed. Supplies disappeared. Units staggered forward in misery. The desert stripped away glory and left only survival. By the time Alexander reached Carmania, the army had paid a terrible price. But even after this, he did not stop. Back in the Western Empire, Alexander began trying to reshape what he had conquered. At Susa in 324 BCE, he organized mass marriages between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen. Alexander himself married Statera, daughter of Darius, while already married to Roxana. Thousands of Macedonians who had taken Asian wives were recognized and rewarded. This was not only celebration, it was policy.
Alexander wanted an empire that could not be held by Macedonians alone. He needed Persian elites, Asian soldiers, local administrators, and a new ruling class tied to him personally. But many Macedonians hated what they saw. To them, the campaign had begun as revenge against Persia. Now their king wore Persian dress, married into the family of Darius, and trained young Persians in Macedonian arms. The tension exploded at Opis. Alexander announced that many old and wounded veterans would be sent home with honors. Instead of gratitude, the Macedonians heard rejection. They believed they were being replaced. The army mutinied.
Alexander responded with fury. He dismissed them in words, called the Persians his kinsmen, and forced the Macedonians to face the possibility that their king could build an empire without them. The confrontation ended in reconciliation, but the wound remained. Then came the greatest personal loss of his life. Hephaestion died at Ecbatana in 324 BCE. He was not just a commander, he was Alexander's closest companion and trusted friend. Alexander's grief was extreme. Ancient sources describe massive mourning, honors, and plans for a great funeral monument. Soon afterward, Alexander campaigned against the Koseans. The empire still had to be secured. Even after everything, Alexander was planning more. Arabia was next.
Ships were prepared. Orders were given. Babylon became the center from which a new expedition would begin. But in 323 BCE, before the Arabian campaign could start, Alexander fell ill in Babylon. The illness lasted days. The sources disagree on details. Some mention fever. Later stories accuse poison. Modern explanations range from infection to disease, but the truth cannot be established with certainty. Alexander had survived Granicus. He had survived Gaza. He had survived the Malian arrow. He had survived deserts and mountains. But in Babylon, at 32 years old, he died. He left no adult, uncontested heir.
And that was the fatal weakness of everything he built. His half-brother Aridaeus became king as Philip III, but he could not rule independently. Roxana was pregnant, and when her child was born, he became Alexander IV. On paper, the Argead dynasty continued. In reality, power passed to the generals. Men who had followed Alexander now began fighting over the world he left behind. The wars of the Diadochi tore the empire apart. No one could hold all of it. No one could become Alexander. His family was destroyed in the struggles that followed. Philip III was killed. Alexander IV was eventually murdered. The bloodline that had conquered Persia vanished into the politics of succession. Out of the wreckage came new kingdoms: Antigonid Macedonia, Ptolemaic Egypt,
the Seleucid Empire in Asia. These states were not Alexander's empire, but they were born from it. That is the final meaning of his story. Alexander conquered faster than any ruler of his age could build. He defeated the Persian Empire, but never had enough time to turn conquest into a stable inheritance. He united Macedonian ambition with Greek culture, Persian kingship, Egyptian monarchy, Central Asian marriage alliances, and Indian frontiers. But the empire depended too much on him. While he lived, impossible things happened. Rivers were crossed, cities fell, mountains were taken, kings fled, armies followed him beyond the edge of fear. When he died, the same empire revealed its truth. It had been held together by motion, victory, charisma, fear, and the belief that Alexander would always be there to decide the next step. Without him, there was no single center. But failure is not the whole story, because Alexander's political empire died, but his historical world survived. The Hellenistic age began from the ruins. In Egypt, Alexandria became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. In Asia, Greek and local cultures mixed in cities, armies, markets, temples, and courts. This began with a young ruler crossing into Asia with limited money, impossible ambition, and an army that trusted speed more than safety. It ends in Babylon, with that same ruler dead, his plans unfinished, his empire already waiting to be divided. Alexander did not create a lasting, unified empire. He created something more unstable, more violent, and more enduring in another way: a new world. A world where Greek and Eastern traditions collided, blended, and transformed each other for centuries. He reached the end of the known world, but the real ending was not a battlefield. It was the silence after him, the moment when every general, every satrap, every soldier understood that the man who gave the empire direction would never give another order. His life was a chain of victories. His death was the beginning of another war. And his legacy was the question every conqueror after him had to face. Is it enough to win the world if no one can hold it when you are gone?